Want to join the TLDR team? Well, we have a few openings at the moment, and you can find out more at the end of this video. Many leaders from across the world and the political spectrum have hailed this as the only way out of the pandemic, the only way we can return to any semblance of normality. We are, of course, talking about vaccines. Getting the population vaccinated and cutting chains of transmission is key to opening up countries. Yet, in spite of its importance, it wasn't long ago we were talking about how the EU had fallen behind in its rollout, with the likes of the UK leading the pack. A story that's appearing to change, with the UK falling off our list altogether. So in this video, we'll take a look at how the EU's vaccine rollout stands today, and how the EU managed to leapfrog to near the top of the pack. Before exploring the EU's vaccine rollout today, it's worth setting the scene a little, and rewinding the clock to a point where the vaccine rollout was marred with controversy. Towards the beginning of this year, regulators around the world, including the UK's Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency and the EU's European Medicines Agency, began licensing a number of vaccines for use. And while the UK, as an individual sovereign state, had contracts to purchase vaccines from the likes of AstraZeneca and Pfizer, EU member states decided to do things differently, establishing a joint procurement programme. To avoid EU countries from fighting over vaccines, the EU would purchase them on their behalf and then distribute them accordingly. So far so good, right? Well, issues arose when the joint procurement programme came under fire for the speed at which jabs were actually getting into arms. As we covered at the time, vast disparities began to arise in the pace of the rollout, with the likes of the UK standing just shy of 4 doses administered per 100 at the start of January, compared to the Netherlands' 0.21 doses per 100. In fact, at the time, when the UK was reaching close to 1.4 million doses administered, France stood at just 6,000. By March, the picture hadn't improved that much. The UK had provided a first vaccination to in excess of 40% of its population, while the EU stood anywhere between 12 and 14%, a figure that couldn't just be explained away by mere rollout issues either. As Gareth Davies, writing for the London School of Economics, highlighted, the difference between Denmark, which minimises its reserves and has jabbed 16%, and most countries, which are on 12%, shows that unused vaccines are not the explanation. Rather, the difference is to do with supply. The UK is getting more. However, the picture has now reversed, with the FT aptly describing how the EU is beginning to lead the vaccine marathon after losing the sprint. At the end of June, the EU as a whole was administering vaccines at double the rate of the US, and at the time of writing, the EU has surpassed the G7 average and the United States on all major indicators of rollout. Total doses per 100 residents, percentage vaccinated with at least one dose, and percentage fully vaccinated. And when we look at the individual countries, not only have some EU states surpassed the likes of the UK and Israel, but they're now close to leading the pack. When looking at the percentage of residents fully vaccinated, Malta is on top, with 81.4%. Then comes Iceland, Denmark, Belgium, Portugal, and Spain. For comparison, the UK stands at 62%, Israel at 60%, and the US at 51%. So it's clear that Europe has taken the lead. But while we've been talking about the EU rollout of the vaccine as something in the hands of the EU, the domestic politicians and domestic parties can't be underestimated, most visibly when it comes to Emmanuel Macron. In July, Macron announced the so-called Pass Sanitaire, aka a vaccine passport obtainable after being fully vaccinated, having a recent negative test, or having recovered from a previous COVID infection. The pass would be mandatory for all events or places with more than 50 people, with it being further extended from August to cover all restaurants, cafes, and shopping centres. The scheme is one of the strictest national vaccine policies in Europe, and has invariably had two outcomes: mass protest and a huge leap in vaccine uptake. For now, we'll just skirt around the protests, but if you'd like us to do a video on the protests and Macron's position and popularity with the 2022 presidential election on the horizon, then let us know in the comments below. Anyway, within a day of the pass's introduction, vaccine appointments exceeded the 1 million mark, And 2 weeks after the announcement, 5 million people had got their first dose, and a further 6 million received their second. At the beginning of August, projections based on reservations on France's central booking system seemed to suggest that some 50 million people over 12 would have been vaccinated with at least one dose by the end of the month, just shy of 75% of the total country's population. Such a requirement to have vaccine passports to enter events is a classic example of behavioural economics, and specifically nudges. While they haven't made vaccination compulsory, there are alternatives to get a pass after all. The pass highly incentivizes getting jabbed. Instead of having to go through the bureaucracy and, let's face it, the discomfort of being tested every 72 hours, you get the jab and life becomes a lot easier. In fact, the French president said as much when addressing the nation, stressing that you've understood vaccination is not immediately obligatory for everyone, but we're going to extend the health pass to the maximum in order to push a maximum of you to go and get vaccinated. This is all compounded further by the French government beginning to charge for coronavirus tests unless requests are accompanied by a prescription from a doctor, making vaccination even more tempting. Crucially, France is far from alone when it comes to these behavioural nudges. In Italy, a green pass has been rolled out, and anyone over the age of 12 must show their pass on entry to the likes of gyms, public transport, educational establishments, and restaurants. And similar schemes have already been launched in Austria, Cyprus, Denmark, Germany, and other countries across Europe. And it certainly seems to work, with the Italian system leading to an increase in demand by as much as 200% in some regions. This has all led to the EU's vaccination rate surpassing and remaining above other nations, although the picture isn't entirely rosy. Despite remaining above the UK and US, vaccination rates are declining in the remaining section of society. Those who are hesitant and anti-vaxxers remain unpersuaded by the moves to require COVID passes, something displayed most notably in the French protests. These protests are in their 6th week already and remain strong and clear. The country's Ministry of Interior estimated that turnout was around 175,000 nationwide, with close to 15,000 in Paris alone, with people crying out, "Macron, we don't want your pass," as many people coalesce against not just the idea of a COVID passport, but more acutely against Macron and his government. But what do you think? Should we be concentrating on who's leading this race? Or should we be concentrating on those left behind, without vaccines? Is the idea of a COVID pass the best way to get jabs into arms? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to contribute more than just comments, then consider joining Team TLDR. We're looking for 3 new contributors for the EU channel to represent France, Germany, and Eastern Europe. These are only voluntary positions, and there's no minimum hours per week. We're just looking for people who can help suggest video topics, explain politics, and fact-check our scripts. Although there is the potential for full-time paid work in the future. So if you're looking for some experience and have a couple of hours a month to help us out, then there's a link to apply in the description. We're also looking for a new full-time video editor in London, so that job is also linked below. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon.